I'm sure there's a child who'll fit it. Are we nearly done? Ah, good. Okay, well, then it's my great pleasure to announce Megan Rawson, who's going to be talking about the pregnant corporation, because we don't have enough capitalism, disaster in a neoliberal world. How is this? Did anybody get this? Oh, I see. I don't know. Nobody's online complaining about the audio with people just standing here, so I'm sure you'll be fine. And someone will shout. That lip seems to be working.
Well, I'm quite quiet, so I'll just. To go? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm not reading my whole title out, but this is basically forming a chapter, hopefully, of my PhD research, which I guess is takes the metaphysics of pregnancy as more of a springboard into some of the other issues that might arise from that. So the ethical issues, for instance. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what it means to be pregnant. So it seems as though in the literature things have been considered the wrong way around. So reproductive rights and the ethics of pregnancy have been discussed and debated to great length. But when it comes to trying to describe exactly what the pregnant organism is, philosophy seems to struggle to give us any sort of satisfactory answers. So I want to take a step back from those ethical discussions and instead focus on what it means to be pregnant. So to be pregnant, to be with child, or the period during which a woman carries a developing fetus normally in the uterus. To carry a child and to be with child both imply a degree of separateness between a pregnant person and the fetus. A separateness which is not so apparent on further consideration, not only metaphysically, but also phenomenologically. Jung writes, a pregnancy is a time when the integrity of my body is undermined by the fact that the boundaries of my body are in flux. There's no clear or delineable way to decide where the fetus ends and where she begins. During pregnancy, the body changes. Is this to incorporate another part or a distinct organism? Is she vessel for the gestating organism, or is she partner in the gestating process? The answers to these questions shouldn't be rushed or taken for granted. And I think that an explanation may help us come to a better understanding of the ontological nature of the pregnant organism. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by briefly talking about the motivations of my research, and then I'm going to look at some of the ontological issues of pregnancy and ontologically abnormal entities, including conjoined twins as a comparison with the pregnant organism. I'm then going to be looking at reconceptualizing pregnancy through group ontologies and particularly focusing on the corporate person. And I'm going to end by considering some of the outcomes that I hope this will have for things like reproductive rights. So the motivations of this research, as I said before, is that essentially forms part of my PhD project, assessing how the metaphysics of pregnancy influences other philosophical conversations, including the ethics of reproductive rights. So it might seem, the obvious next step of the metaphysics of pregnancy might seem to be considering how the ethical literature has been influenced by the metaphysical conversations, and more importantly, how the model that we choose might impact the ethics. However, first, I think it's crucial to consider the ontological issues that arise out of the metaphysical debate. So, Heloise Robinson argues that a pregnant woman appears to be a new kind of being. The pregnant person is in a position of ontological uniqueness, where she appears to be made up of more than one entity, but not quite two, in a continuous though temporary bifurcating process. Unlike Robinson, I don't wish to claim that the pregnant person possesses a superior moral status, but instead I want to focus on untangling the strangeness of this ontological situation. So, we've kind of briefly discussed this in the last one. Thinking sort of less metaphysically and more on the individual side of things, if you will, how many organisms are present, or cells or individuals or whatever you want to say, are present during gestation? This seems to be one of the more significant yet maybe tricky questions. The intuitive response socioculturally perhaps would be to say 2. After all, our norms, at least in the Western world, underpin and moreover perpetuate the treatment of pregnant person and fetus as separate. Consider the way we talk of baby whilst the fetus is still in utero. Baby is already a person and we are merely awaiting its arrival. Its parents are expecting. This is in part due to the obvious fact that in normal cases we expect that when somebody becomes pregnant, this will result in the birth of a baby. Separation is the anticipated outcome. Socially, medically, and legally, we tend to treat pregnant people as though they are 2. And yet, if we recall Jung's comment above, during gestation, boundaries seem to be in flux. It's not at all clear where one ends and the other begins. Therefore, it cannot be taken for granted that there are 2 clearly discrete entities present during pregnancy. If, on the other hand, we accept that the fetus is indeed part of its gestational carrier, does this mean that we must also accept that there is only one individual or self present during pregnancy? It's important here to acknowledge that a lot of the language we use to describe pregnancy is steeped in pro-container bias. It's also true that pregnancy appears to add something to a person, not least that she goes from being person to pregnant person, perhaps. Her ontological status has changed. The question now is, what has it changed to? Is she one organism, individual, who is housing another completely separate organism or individual? It would seem that the topology of the umbilical cord, among other things, would suggest not. Does this then mean that she is one organism of which a new part but not separate individual or self has been introduced, which will one day be a separate individual? The issue here is that we need to be able to account for continuity between the fetus and the newborn. Is it feasible that the new organism comes into existence only after birth? Perhaps when the umbilical cord is severed. But we also want to acknowledge that there is a sameness of stuff before and after birth. So I feel that it seems equally wrong to say that there is one individual present during pregnancy as it does to say that there are 2. It could, of course, be the case that our perceptions of which model speaks to the truth of the nature of pregnancy depend entirely on when in the gestational process we are considering. For instance, in the earlier stages of pregnancy, there is a greater level of physiological closeness present, as well as a high degree of fetal dependency on the gestational carrier, and thus we might be more inclined to say that the parthood model of pregnancy better represents this period of gestation. In the earlier weeks of gestation, normally before 22 weeks, the fetus would be unable to survive detachment from the maternal body. In light of this, it may make more sense to view the fetus as a part of its gestational carrier during these earlier stages of pregnancy. Gestation is a process of becoming. The fetus grows from a wholly dependent embryo to a self-sustaining infant. There may then be a gradational aspect to the way that we view them, or to the model that we accept during pregnancy. In this respect, it appears that the way we view pregnancy metaphysically can and also possibly should change as the pregnancy progresses. And that while the container model seems at odds with our perception of the earlier stages of gestation, it perhaps is more in line with later stages of gestation, at least the way we view pregnancy socioculturally. As pregnancy reaches its end, the late-stage fetus possesses a significantly higher degree of functionality than at the beginning of pregnancy. By the end of the second trimester, the pregnant person will be aware of their fetus in a way that they were not earlier in the gestational process. By this stage, fetuses will have begun to move, which will normally be detectable by the pregnant person, as well as the fetal heartbeat being detectable. The fetus will have grown and the pregnant person's bump will be usually noticeable. Moreover, the fetus will begin to look like a human being as the gestation continues, which has become more obvious with improvements in ultrasound technologies and 4D scans, for instance. It's much harder not to see late-stage fetuses as people separate from their gestational carriers. On that view, it then perhaps makes more sense, at least socioculturally, to view later stage pregnancy as one of containment rather than parenthood. But this is not to say that this containment is exactly the same as the one Smith and Brogard argue for in 16 days. For one, the topological connection evidenced by the umbilical cord and placenta is still very much present throughout the whole pregnancy and does not end until the cord is severed postnatally. And the gravida's body will continue to perform the same functional duties for the foster at all stages of pregnancy. Elements of parenthood remain throughout the entire pregnancy and often beyond. Think fourth trimester, for instance. It's our perceptions of the fetus as a separate entity and possibly as a separate person, but I won't go into that, which changes as the pregnancy progresses. Perhaps then the supposed ontological trickiness of pregnancy, as well as the ontologically tricky situations such as conjoined twins, comes from our insistence that these phenomena can or ought to be explained away by our cultural, sociological, or even potentially biological norms. Both pregnancy and conjoined twins are ontologically strange in that two entities, cells, whatever we want to say, form one organism. They are spatially located in one body. It's thus the assumption that cells are discrete entities with complete external boundaries, which causes a lot of this confusion when dealing with pregnancy and conjoined twins, as well as other ontologically unusual cases. This permeates the language that we use when describing these phenomena. We say conjoined twins. We've already assumed a separation by the use of the word twins. We've assumed that there are two of something. We have imposed our own understanding of what it means to be a discrete entity upon an entirely different kind of organism. It's interesting that much discussion surrounding the philosophy of conjoined twins, whether through ethics, phenomenology, or otherwise, seems to focus sometimes exclusively on the need for separation. And it's often the case that medical surgeons seem to encourage and have been accused of coercing the separation of conjoined twins in all cases. In fact, Quigley also points out that the operations to separate conjoined twins are considered successful even if only one of the twins survives. It appears that the literature treats conjoined twins as something tragic or else something monstrous, something that should not exist. Seems as though we are uncomfortable with the notion that what we might normally refer to as two people, but may indeed be an entirely distinct kind of thing, can inhabit one physical space in this way. This may explain the push to separate conjoined twins, but also, as mentioned above, our use of the word twins assumes that separation must exist. We do the same with pregnant organisms. The term pregnant is commonly used as an adjective, which is then applied to an entity, an organism, a woman, or a person, as though the being pregnant part is separate from the being a person part, again assuming a separation of some kind here. In both cases, we are pressurized into thinking of these both conjoined twins and pregnant organisms as separate selves, if not separate people, rather than considering that we may be dealing with wholly new types of entities here. It may be useful to change language use to move away from this. For instance, instead of using the word pregnant as an adjective to apply to an existing organism, we could instead use the word as a noun, acknowledging a new entity and a new ontological status. A similar concept could be applied to conjoined twins, for instance, conjoined or conjoined entities. Changing the way that we talk about pregnancy in this way would allow us to move away from this notion of conflict, which plagues the literature and which I will come to in a second. It may be instead better to start from a place of commonality, the shared interest and symbiosis that exists both in cases of pregnant and conjoined entities. In the case of pregnancy, for instance, there is evidence of symbiosis through, for instance, fetal microchimerism. With conjoined entities, Monroe highlights a case of a conjoined entity named Jody and Mary who faced a legal battle over separation, as Mary, who was weaker, would die if separated from the conjoined entity whole. Monroe shows how, despite a clear physical as well as relational bond of interdependence and a highly observable manifestation of connection, the court proceedings focused almost exclusively on the supposed conflict present and referred to Mary as parasite and aggressor throughout. Despite this, there's a necessary and mutual dependence that exists both in pregnant and conjoined entities. Both selves, or and maybe in the case of the fetus, pre-self, which are parts of the ontological organism, are necessary to each other for the survival of the organism. For instance, if one element or part of the pregnant were to disappear, i.e. the fetus, then the pregnant would metaphorically die. The pregnant cannot survive the loss of one of its parts, and the conjoined entity also cannot survive the loss of its parts. For instance, the pregnant person reverts to the person, the conjoined entity reverts to two separate people or one living person, if that makes sense. It's my belief then that reconceptualizing the pregnant as a group will help us to avoid the narrative that the Gravida and Foster are two warring individuals, or that the Foster is invading the Gravida's space like a parasite. It's clear that this conception doesn't work. It's also clear that treating the pregnant as an individual doesn't work either. Therefore, I want to reconsider this through the lens of group ontologies. So we need to consider the type of group we're talking about. It's clear that the group relation in pregnancy is one that's extremely unified. There is a high degree of not only physical and biological, but also psychological closeness present during pregnancy, as well as the obvious spatial closeness too. Peter French differentiates between aggregate and conglomerate groups. So aggregate groups are described as mere collections of individuals, such as a crowd of people standing at a bus stop. A conglomerate group is more unified and formally constituted as an organization. So whereas an aggregate group is made up of individual people who retain their individualness, conglomerate groups have a status above and beyond the individual status of their members, for instance, as a corporation. Even though those who make up the corporation may be individual people, together as an organized group, they possess a unified status which transcends this. Crucially, the status of conglomerates as organized and thus unified allows for the possibility of moral rights and responsibilities being placed upon it as an entity instead of merely a group of individuals. It's clear that due to the level of unification present during a pregnancy, that it makes more sense to view pregnancy as a conglomerate type of group. For the purpose of this analogy, I would like to focus particularly on the corporation. This may seem like a strange analogy. However, I think there are useful crossovers between the way that we consider corporations and the way that we consider pregnancy. So first, corporation, from the Latin corpus, which means body, already seems to suggest the physical sense with which the notion of corporate personhood is used. The idea of the corporate person can evoke a sense of the flesh and blood body or bodies that arises from these metaphors. Questions of space again are asked. Where is the corporation spatially located? Who owns that body or space? We're reminded again of the difficulty of ontologically complex beings. Despite the fact that corporations are a recognized legal fiction, we know that they're not real people capable of, for instance, decision-making. Our language humanizes the corporation in a way that I think is useful for conceptualizing pregnancy. Additionally, the corporation is made up of parts, just as the pregnant is made up of parts. The language we use to describe The language used to describe corporate persons, however, is the opposite of the language used to describe pregnancy. We recognize that corporate persons are made up of many parts, either in terms of literal employees or in terms of material assets of the corporation. Yet the language we use condenses this group into one distinct entity. We do the opposite with pregnancy. We take an organism that is spatially located in one place and we draw the parts out from this. This causes the ontological confusion. I think that this analogy can help us elucidate some of these difficulties. So I think there are two main ways that we can conceive of the parts of the corporation. The first is considering employees as parts. Here we might say that if the corporation is made up of employees. Here we might say that if there were no individuals who work for the corporation, then the corporation wouldn't exist. in the same way that the pregnant would not exist without the gravida or the foster. There are two main things here. First, it seems that the loss of parts of individuals as parts, is more detrimental to the pregnant than to the corporation. If the gravida or foster ceases to be a part, then the pregnant dies, sometimes literally. In corporations, however, individual employees tend to be dispensable and are often easily replaced by other workers who then become parts of the corporation in their place. This is obviously not the case of pregnancy. Additionally is the issue of consent. An individual who applies for and receives a job for a corporation has willingly become a part of said corporation. This is impossible in pregnancy, as fetuses are never able to consent to becoming parts of the pregnant. And of course, sometimes agents who are pregnant do not consent to being or becoming a part of the pregnant either. The second way then that we can conceive of this is by considering that fetuses might be more like the material assets owned by a corporation, for instance, buildings, equipment, money, things like that. What this latter conception allows for is the creation of a clearer analogy with the fetus as a non-operative member of the corporation, yet one which still possesses value. As stated before, this is not a perfect analogy. One obvious inconsistency here is that the importance of the parts to the survival of the group differ. So the parts of pregnants are significantly more integral to the survival of a pregnant than the parts of corporations are. If the corporation were to lose some of its parts, for instance, some of its material assets, this does not mean that it ceases to be a corporation. I don't think that this is fatal to the analogy, as it could be the case that the part which the corporation has lost is a sufficient portion of its assets or materials which causes the death of the corporation. Another reason why I think this analogy works is that corporations are understood as legal persons. One theory, for instance, states that corporations are real entities, that the corporation is something real above and beyond its constituent parts. Just like the business corporation, we recognize a legal status as person along with the rights. Hang on, I skipped a line. Sorry, with the pregnant corporation, we also recognize a legal status as a person along with the rights which go with such a status. But how is the pregnant corporation formed? Another way we can think about this is to say that corporations are made up of departments. There we go. In the case of the pregnant corporation, we could say that it can only exist if it's made of at least two departments, being the fetus and the agent who is pregnant. Obviously, in the case of multiple pregnancy, you can add those departments on. Without either of these departments, the pregnant corporation would not or would cease to exist. And as I said before, this seems to be stricter for pregnancy than it is for other types of corporations. With other corporations, if a particular department is dissolved, the corporation could still be recognized as a corporation, but this is not the case with pregnancy. On this analogy, it seems that there is something above and beyond the fetus and the agent who is pregnant, which makes up the pregnant corporation. So why reconceptualize pregnancy in this way? So as I briefly mentioned before, it's my belief that a reconsideration of pregnancy as groups can help us to overcome some of the trickier ethical dilemmas that normally arise when we talk about pregnancy, particularly the so-called maternal-fetal conflict and the ensuing reproductive rights clashes. For one, considering pregnancy as a type of group helps us to avoid the language of separation and containment, which is what in part has led to us considering the agent who is pregnant and fetus as two distinct people in the first place. Just as with the corporation, there is a sense of the group transcending the individual, and this same concept can be applied to pregnancy. Additionally, understanding the corporate group being somehow above and beyond its individual members allows for a sense of collective agency. One of the main issues that tends to crop up repeatedly in the literature on the ethics of reproductive rights stems from this issue of clashing rights or clashing needs or interests. As I pointed out before, constantly painting the agent who is pregnant and the fetus as warring individuals is what has led to the conceptual confusion in the first place. But we have to acknowledge that in some cases, pregnants are made up of parts with clashing interests. For instance, termination of the pregnancy may be in the interest of the agent who is pregnant, whereas continued survival may be in the interest of the fetus. Analogizing pregnancy with the corporate person allows us to understand a sense in which there is an entity or even sense of agency which goes above and beyond the individual parts or members which make up the group. We may also wish to say that there is a sense in which group interests supersede individual interests. For instance, we may say that when somebody becomes pregnant, they should stop smoking. Although smoking may be an interest for them as an individual, it is not within the interest of the wider group or pregnant corporation. We might wish to say that the group interest of the pregnant corporation is maintenance of the pregnancy, and that this interest supersedes the individual interest of the agent who is pregnant. To, for instance, smoke on this example. There are occasionally times when the goals of the corporation and the individual clash. In the case of corporations, for example, it may be that the corporation declares a particular policy or political stance which an individual employee may fundamentally disagree with and does not want to represent such a policy or view. Here, there's a clash between the collective group of the corporation as a whole and the interest of this particular employee. Of course, on that example, the employee can choose to leave his job if he wishes. I think we can use the same rule to apply to pregnancy. If the pregnancy is causing physical or mental harm to the agent who is pregnant, then they ought to be permitted to leave the pregnant corporation, which in this case would be via termination. One of the most obvious distinctions between corporations and pregnants is the autonomy of the individuals who make up the group. The agents who make up the corporation share a level of autonomy. They have consciously chosen to work for the corporation and are free to leave if they choose. This is not the case with the pregnant corporation. While there is much debate on the moral status of the fetus, it's clear that fetuses are not autonomous agents. They lack the decision-making capacity. They have no choice about becoming members of the pregnant corporation, nor do they have the choice to leave. Since agents who are pregnant do not lack this choice, they can choose to enter and leave the pregnant corporation. There is an asymmetry in the level of autonomy possessed by group members. This asymmetry may then affect how we balance the interests and then potentially the rights of group members of the pregnant corporation. Not only does the agent who is pregnant have a higher decision-making capacity, but there also is a higher risk involved for the agent with regards to continuing the pregnancy. Because of this, it makes sense to consider primary and secondary rights here. The pregnant corporation cannot take action until a rational and autonomous individual takes action first. A fetus is not an autonomous or rational individual, and thus this falls to the agent who is pregnant. It is the agent who is pregnant's actions which are primary, and thus, imagining the pregnant organism as corporation, the pregnant corporation's actions are secondary. The moral rights which then stem from these secondary actions would too be secondary. So for instance, if we think of business corporations, the agents who make up the corporation have the right to fair and equal treatment. This is the primary right. That then stems to the corporation having a secondary right to a fair trial. So for our analogy, this would mean that the agent who is pregnant has primary rights, whereas the pregnant corporation has secondary rights. Now, because the fetus is a part but not a rational or autonomous part of the corporation, it would seemingly also partake in secondary rights. This potentially means that while we still owe duties to the fetus as a secondary rights holder or part of the pregnant corporation, these may be lesser than the duties which are owed to the agent who is pregnant. Okay. Nearly done. We may also wish to discuss other duties. This time duties that third parties might owe to the corporation. Earlier, I said that one of the goals of the pregnant corporation may be to sustain itself at least as far as is feasible. If this is the case, then other parties may have a duty to ensure the possibility and practicability of agents being able to continue their pregnancies as far as feasible. This could refer both to the state, but also to society more generally, and particularly close relatives of the agent who is pregnant. Practically, on a government level, this might look like ensuring equal access to maternity rights, as well as ensuring the state's maternity rights and laws are fit for purpose. It may also involve ensuring that agents have access to an adequate amount of maternity leave during and after pregnancy, as well as making sure that they are being sufficiently supported socially, medically, and financially in order to help them to healthily maintain their pregnancy. Conversely, it also means ensuring that there is sufficient support and access to reproductive services and technologies, including termination, in order to preserve the mental and physical health of agents who are experiencing unwanted pregnancies. On a social level, duties towards the pregnant corporation may include things like working to remove social stigmas that might exist against pregnant agents, as well as working to support and avoid discriminating against those who are pregnant. Finally, who counts as a member of the pregnant corporation? Are the agent who is pregnant and the fetus only members of the corporation because of their spatial location within the body of the agent who is pregnant? The paternal agent does not share in the spatial location that creates this unique ontological situation that the pregnant is in. He remains firmly external to this. He has, however, provided biological material to create a fetus and thus has an interest in the pregnancy or a stake in the pregnant corporation. Despite the fact that he is physically distant, he is still biologically connected to the group entity. Similarly, in the case of surrogacy, we have a situation wherein an agent who bears no biological relation to the fetus is gestating for another agent or agents who are biologically related to the fetus. In this case, both genetic parents of the fetus have an interest or stake in the pregnancy and yet are both external to the pregnant corporation. If we allow the agents external from the pregnant body can also be members of the pregnant corporation, what kind of role would these members have? If we continue to follow the analogy, we might say that a comparison can be made between this type of external agent and shareholders. So a quick note of clarification, the main distinction between a shareholder and a stakeholder is that a shareholder has partial ownership over a corporation, for instance, some kind of financial investment in the company. A stakeholder is an agent who is affected, any agent who is affected by the decision-making or actions that a corporation takes. In other words, anyone who has a stake in the company. It seems when applying the analogy that biological parents of the fetus are comparable to shareholders. This works both for fathers and also for biological parents in the case of surrogacy. They have contributed a biological investment as opposed to a financial investment to the pregnant corporation. Stakeholders, on the other hand, have not necessarily invested financially or, in the case of the pregnant corporation, biologically, but nevertheless are impacted by the decisions that are made or the actions that are taken by the corporation. It's important to note that all shareholders are stakeholders, but not all stakeholders are shareholders. Therefore, we might say that beyond the biological parents of the fetus, other family members and potentially even society more generally are stakeholders in the pregnant corporation. Decisions made by the pregnant corporation may have an impact on all of the aforementioned. There may be a duty to weigh the interests of shareholders in the pregnant corporation in decision-making. It might be the case that we wish to refer to majority versus minority shareholders here. Again, following the analogy of the corporation, a majority shareholder is one who owns more than 50% of the corporation, and a minority shareholder is one who owns less than 50%. We might use this to aid our puzzle of how much say shareholders, and particularly those who are external to the pregnant body, get in the pregnant corporation's decision-making process. So as said before, anyone who contributes financially to a company has an investment in it and is thus considered a shareholder. The same can be said about pregnancy. Anybody with a biological investment in the pregnancy are shareholders in the pregnant corporation. However, the level of investment might differ. We might wish to consider the agent who is pregnant the majority shareholder, as her biological investment to the pregnant corporation is larger, for instance, than the paternal agent's biological investment. This would mean that while the paternal parent might have a say in decisions made by the pregnant corporation, this would have less weight than the say of the agent who is pregnant as majority shareholder in the pregnant corporation. Obviously, this becomes a lot trickier when we think of surrogacy. However, I'm not going to cover that here because I think I may have run out of time. So I'll go backwards again. So just to say that the purpose of this research is to hopefully change our perceptions and understandings of reproductive rights, including things like abortion, surrogacy, but also maybe reproductive technologies of the future, and hopefully elucidating some of the difficulties that have arisen from the way we normally conceive of pregnancy socioculturally. And thank you.
Yeah. So maybe, oh, so yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I can see how thinking about pregnancy in terms of cooperation, right, can be illuminating. But I remember you started your presentation with a kind of account, and you mentioned that, you know, during the pregnancy, the things change. I mean, the relationship between the fetus and the mother changes. So how do you look at it from the, maybe it escaped my attention, that how to, from the cooperation point of view, how you look at this changing dynamics of pregnancy. And then also there is something like, you know, there is some kind of, let's say, as an analogy, there is some kind of resonance that cooperation involves some kind of corporation, so not corporation. It involves some kind of cooperation towards some kind of goal. And so, how do you see this goal here? How do you define it here?
So with the first part, this is kind of one of the reasons I was toying with this idea of shareholders. I've not got a fully formed answer yet because I've literally only had that idea last week. So it's pretty new in my head. But I think also because even at the end of pregnancy, the fetus still isn't what we would call rational or autonomous, as in it's still before birth. So it's still in utero, if you will. That I don't know if it's detrimental. But that's why I was toying with this idea of shareholders. As for goals, it's birth is the goal of the pregnant corporation, like maintenance of the pregnancy in like normal healthy cases. And then this is why I think you can have the caveat for termination if there's physical or mental distress being caused by the pregnancy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but yeah, so this kind of answers my question, but like you mentioned at the beginning that in pregnancy there is some kind of, you know, that the pregnancy changes, right? The relationship between the fetus and the mother changes during pregnancy. So how does it translate into this concept of cooperation? Like, how do we, when we think about pregnancy in terms of cooperation, how this changing relationship can be framed in terms of cooperation?
In what sense do you mean? Sorry,
because you know, because let's say you hinted at the beginning that, let's say, at the early stages of pregnancy there's some kind of let's say more kind of closer bond or association between the fetus and the mother, and then there's some kind of bifurcation sort of process. How do you think about it in terms of cooperation?
I don't think I have yet, really. Do you think that's something I need to look at a bit more? I was just in terms of the shareholder thing I was thinking, and also like in terms of the fetus as an asset rather than as an employee, if that makes sense.
I understand. I mean, I see why thinking about pregnancy in terms of corporation may, you know, elucidate some aspects of pregnancy.
But there are still like tricky bits that I need to work out.
Yeah, maybe like, you know, thinking about it like how because pregnancy is not stop. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Nice conversation.
Yeah, but so we will continue later.
Anna. Oh, that thing, yeah?
I just wonder about maybe a better analogy in the corporation might be something like a rock band. Not maybe not pop band, but let's say. I was just reminded of this by the idea of the relationship within the band changes over time. So these individuals will kind of develop their own skill capacities and so on, and that be a I think maybe the aim of the ban is to eventually, but maybe that's a disadvantage to the aim of the ban is to live forever.
Solo careers of
Yeah.
bands members.
Thank you so much for this. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I came in a little bit late, so I want to say from the outset, I really like what you're doing here. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's going to be an interesting tool on the spectrum that I'm gonna lay out in the next talk, so that's kind of cool too. On the one hand, I mean, I think that this could be really beneficial, like from a legal standpoint, right? We have these concepts in place already because certain courts have granted corporations personhood. And so now we find ourselves in this weird discursive space, and we can kind of, now say, aha, well, now we're going to apply pregnancy and understand it as a corporation. But what if you're kind of like me and you're already really worried about the kind of neoliberal capitalist discourse surrounding pregnancy and like the notion of like pregnancy and productivity, especially when it comes to ideas like, so I'm always bringing up like pregnancy loss, miscarriage and stuff, but like miscarriages as failures, the idea that someone who is infertile is somehow not productive or not producing in the right ways. So suppose I came to you and I said, look, this just reinforces that whole kind of neoliberal discourse that we should be trying to move away from if we want to have like a feminist view of pregnancy. Do you have something that you could respond there? Do you have a response to that?
No. No, but it's a really good point, and I've noted it down. Because I was literally just using it as an analogy. I think the way I got into this is because I was trying to think of pregnancy as a group. And when I was reading the literature on groups, the first thing that came up was the corporation. Other people have like given me other examples of things, that other types of groups that might be useful, which I have a big list of somewhere. But I just kind of wanted to iron out what exactly it is I'm trying to say through the corporation, and then I can start to think of the way of reframing it in other ways. But I think this is a really good point. Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, just by way of suggestion, what you might suggest then is just like, look, it's time that feminists just reappropriate that. Like, if we're going to be operating in this structure anyway, we might as well use it to our advantage. And then try to think about the kinds of advantages that use of corporate language would have. That's something we would all stand.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really useful. I think that there are other analogies and things I want to look at. It's literally just that this was the first big one I found, but I think this is a really valid point to look at. So thank you.
Right, thank you. Those super interesting. I wanted to ask a bit about the conjoined twins case that you brought up sort of earlier on, and then you didn't go on to develop it in terms of how it would sort of fit with the corporation idea. And I suppose there's like two parts. There's a question, and then there's a sort of an half question, half reflection that you can take away, which is like you brought up the criticism of the way the Mary and Jodie case was decided as a case of sort of conflict between two individuals. And I'm interested in whether you've thought about whether your model would actually change how that reasoning might have gone forward. Because in that particular case, there's no like, there wasn't an individual rational agent there. Like a decision was being made on behalf of Mary and Jodie, or Mary and Jodie together, however you want to conceptualize it. And it seems to me that you would still end up with the same situation of, if you think of Mary and Jodie each as departments, for example, then you still have a case of interests which pull apart. Like it's not possible to meet the interests of both departments in a decision there, if you look at it in that way. And, you know, anyway, I could say more, but I probably won't. And then my sort of thought beyond that is whether it might be useful to think about this a little bit, about those sorts of cases a little bit more in relation to sort of legal and ethical questions that arise for when pregnant corporations are do not necessarily at that point in time involve a rational autonomous agent, or are deemed at that point in time not to involve a rational autonomous agent. So like questions where cases where questions of like mental capacity are being raised.
Thank you. That's a good reflection. I'll be honest, I haven't considered conjoined twins at all, because I was literally just using them as a illustration, I guess, of how the literature also doesn't really cope well with them as what I've termed ontologically abnormal. And I also think that if I started to think about how my analogy would work for conjoined twins, I would probably go down some kind of crazy rabbit hole that I don't necessarily want to go down. So I think I'm going to leave that work for somebody else. If they think it's a good analogy, it might not work. I think I've only been looking at this as an analogy of, or a different way, if you will, of reconceptualizing pregnancy for a few months. So I've not got all the answers or the conclusions. And it might be that it doesn't work very well at all for conjoined entities or twins, whatever we want to say. And it might be that it doesn't work very well for pregnancy either. I don't know. So I haven't really considered it, but I like this reflection. So thank you, because I haven't thought about that yet.
Oh, maybe I heard. I was just wondering, just on this, just maybe to defend your analogy a bit, but I mean, it seems one possible implication would be that you should kind of give some kind of legal weight to the corporation, if you will, of Jodie and Mary, that you shouldn't just consider the interests of one or the other, but you should also, in that legal context, consider the interests of the corporation itself. Maybe you don't agree, but it just seems to me that there could be very interesting implications of that framework in those cases as well.
I think I do agree. I think that's the nice way of thinking about it. But I'm leaving it firmly aside before I, because I'm going to focus on pregnancy as a whole, right? I don't want to start thinking about other things. But yeah, no, I do agree. I think.
So a little bigger. So I think a straightforward way to make the analogy in case of the conjoined twins would be to just consider them equal shareholders.
Yeah, I think that would be where I go. But then it would, if you say they have equal shares, if you will, then I think we still get the difficulty, I suppose. So it depends on how we weigh the shares, if you will. But yeah, I think I think the shareholder analogy will end up being quite useful.
Like shareholder, not there's a distinction about between shareholder and influence of another human being. So to have a share in company equally, which is a separate entity with its own kind of future and is not exactly the same as saying like interests of the person.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Yeah, I have many questions, but I'll try and choose one. So looking at the ethical implications, and you sort of touched on potential like rights or responsibilities of the pregnant corporation. So if I've understood correctly, once a pregnancy begins, the pre-pregnant or person who was not pregnant is replaced by a pregnant corporation that is made up of the person who is pregnant and the fetus, but they are together the pregnant corporation, and that pregnant corporation might have rights and responsibilities in the same way that a corporation might have specific kind of duties like to the environment or something that is not the duty carried by an individual within the corporation.
Yeah.
Okay. So then if it's the corporation, the pregnant corporation who has relevant moral duties, for example, not to smoke during pregnancy, if that duty is not fulfilled, then when the pregnancy is over and you once again just have a person and a baby, there is no one there who can be held liable, presumably, because the entity that had the relevant duty has ceased to exist because the corporation
Oh,
has
I see.
dissolved. And if that's not the case, and we're saying, well, no, it's not the corporation that has these duties, it's the pregnant agent and not the fetus, then I'm not sure how the corporation ontology changes the ethical picture.
Okay, so what I was thinking is the agent who is pregnant has duties towards the pregnant corporation, which she is also spatially located in, if that makes sense, or a part of, but she has individual duties as a rational agent that the fetus doesn't have. It might be that it really isn't very useful at all. I can't dispute that, but it's that she as an agent has duties towards so the goal or the duty of the pregnant corporation might be maintenance of the pregnancy where feasible. So there might be cases where maintenance of the pregnancy isn't feasible, and that's a different situation, but that is the duty, if you will, of the pregnant corporation. The agent who is pregnant has specific duties as a part of an employee, if you will, just for argument's sake, of the corporation. So if once the pregnant corporation was dissolved, if she had failed in her duties towards the pregnant corporation, that might change things. It might not be useful. I don't know. Did that help?
I think so, but I might grab you in the break to go further.
Okay.
Don't want to take too much time.
Thank you. Okay, so this was interesting just because it was quite different, but I have a more kind of general worry, which is, so you mentioned the different kinds of groups, right? And you want us to believe that pregnancy is like a communal conglomerate group, but you didn't tell us why we should believe that, right?
Because pregnancy is more physiologically unified. So that the other type of group that I looked at, the aggregate group, would be more like a crowd of people standing at a bus stop. But it's clear that the connection, if you will, between the parts of the pregnant corporation are much more unified than what we might say is a group of people standing at a bus stop.
Yeah, but with a lot kind of rests on this idea that it's a conglomerate, and why are my two middle and ring fingers on my left hand not a conglomerate, but a woman and her fetus is. So usually when we're talking about moving from lower level individuals to higher level individuals, we're only justified in making that move if the higher level individual has some property which the lower level, which is not exhausted by accounting for all of the properties of the lower level individuals. Right? Why are we justifying this move from a lower level to a higher level individual? Because we may well think that everything is exhausted by just talking about the woman and the fetus. There's nothing, we don't gain any new entity. There is no sui generis third entity that has anything which is not already accounted for by accounting for a woman and her rights and a fetus and its rights, and that's it. That's all there is. So in order to motivate the existence of a conglomerate, what else has come into existence? What has happened, and why should this conglomerate have anything over and above the rights and responsibilities of its members towards each other?
Well, I think it's just a different way of conceptualizing group rights that helps us move away from this sort of conflict, right? So,
But people within a corporation might be in conflict, right? Different departments in a university are in conflict over, like, this is normal stuff. And equally, people at a bus stop have a responsibility not to shove each other in front of the bus, right? That's also, but they're not a conglomerate. And so what, in order to say that we're moving from one level, a lower level to a higher level, I would like to see some reason, like an ontological reason, not just that this is a convenient way of talking about a group.
I shall consider. I have no answer right now.
Yeah. What?
That was a yes.
I mean, like, oh, okay, my follow-up was just like, why not? Like, what's so bad, why do we need an ontological reason, why isn't a pragmatic reason enough? I mean, it's nice to have ontological reasons for sure, but if we have good political and pragmatic reasons, I'm not saying there are with respect to this model, but like, if we have those, what's so it's kind of the counterpoint, and I was just like, well, why do we need the ontological reason? If we got the
Yeah, I would still say that.
we can fix this.
I haven't.
Thanks. I just wanted to clarify the point of whether or not the woman who is not pregnant ceases to exist when she becomes pregnant, because I thought that was very worrying. And also, I'm not sure it's consistent with the view, because if a corporation is made of these two entities, and they're both essential to the existence of the corporation, then it can't be the case that the pre-pregnancy woman ceased to exist,
No,
right?
I don't think she does. I
She
think
doesn't.
just becomes part of. I'm sorry, I don't think I made that
So,
clear.
okay,
But the agent is still the agent. She's just now the agent. This is why I avoid saying pregnant agent, and I say agent who is pregnant, because I think then
right.
it keeps
So
that.
that agent predates the pregnancy. Is it the same agent that existed before the pregnancy,
Yeah.
but now is pregnant?
Now is part of the pregnant corporation.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just that there's a new ontological entity, which is the pregnant corporation, which did not exist before and is made of these two things, one of which existed before and the other one is now coming into existence.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
That makes sense.
That was an easy one. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for being late. Maybe you clarified this before, but is there a difference between wanted and unwanted pregnancies in this account? Because it seems to me that in cooperation, there is a kind of willingness of the members of the cooperation to create the cooperation.
This is one of the biggest difficulties that I've found with this analogy. So this is why I say it's not a perfect analogy. So this is what I was trying to think of in terms of thinking of it as assets rather than employees. But there's obviously still some difficulties there. But that's also why I had the little caveat of saying that it's not a necessity to maintain the corporation in those cases. But yeah, I recognize that as a potential worry and a not a perfect analogy.
And then, so we have a mini break, this is quite generous.